Welcome to the COGGS Dialogues. I am your host Mohammed Saqib. Today we are discussing how the shifting tides of global trade and investment are reshaping the global south. In a world of increasing trade restrictions, technology barriers, and intensifying superpower rivalries, nations of the global south face complex challenges. Joining me to shed light on these critical issues are two distinguished voices in international trade. Dr. Nisha Taneja, my co host and professor at ICRIER, whose expertise spans from Indian policy making to international organizations like the World Bank, ADB, and UN agencies, and Dr. Stephen Olson, a former US trade negotiator who has shaped global trade discourse through his work with the World Economic Forum and leading universities across Asia, Middle East, and America. I will ask Dr. Nisha to lead the discussion.
So, we're living in a very complex world today. And in recent years, we've seen trade restrictions and sanctions like never before. So, what do you think the implications of these developments are for the global south, both for the Western world and for the Northwestern world?
Sure. Well, look, I don't think there's any question that for countries in the global south, it's going to be an increasingly difficult balancing act as they try to avoid ending up as collateral damage in these great power rivalries that we're unfortunately observing. Look, let's face a simple reality. Trade is growing more difficult and more complex. For the past 8 decades or so, we've been fortunate to live in a world in which we have more or less been moving towards a reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers. To a certain extent, at least, now we're starting to tilt back in the opposite direction. Tariff and non-tariff barriers are on the rise. As a result of sanctions, technology restrictions, trade is becoming increasingly more complicated. If you look at some of the technology, the United States just recently announced that they were ratcheting up some of the technology restrictions on China. The second point is that unfortunately, a number of countries in the global south, and I think this is especially true in Southeast Asia, are going to increasingly find themselves, quote unquote, forced to choose. Okay, for most of these countries, their national interests are best served by striking a balance between some of these larger geopolitical rivals. And in the context of ASEAN, I'm talking in particular US-China. They very assiduously attempt to avoid tilting too close to the United States or tilting too close to China. As the geopolitical rivalry intensifies, I think we're seeing both the United States and China working very hard to try to nudge those countries a little bit closer in their direction. So I have to admit, I always chuckle a little bit whenever I would see Secretary of State Anthony Blinken or Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen or other senior officials get up behind a podium and very emphatically proclaim the United States has no interest in forcing countries to choose between the US and China. And then they would go on and they would announce 3 new policies which were explicitly designed to force countries to choose between the US and China. That was always the signal that a new policy was coming when they would make that statement. But let's face it, China is playing the same game. China now has policies in place that punish companies for complying with US sanctions. Geopolitical rivalries, geopolitical tensions, increased tariff and non-tariff barriers, more technology restrictions, more sanctions, more compliance, and in short, a much more complicated and difficult landscape for countries of the global south to navigate.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Now, in addition to this balancing act that the countries find themselves in, do you think there could be other alliances that might happen. For instance, do you see BRICS coming up as an alternative, where they take the lead role to channelize trade and investment?
This is an interesting point. I'll make a couple of comments. One thing is that, look, as trade becomes more complicated with the big fish, I think more and more countries of the global south are going to look around and say, well, hang on a second. The engine of global economic growth is not coming from the European Union. The engine of economic growth is not coming from the United States of America. It's coming from the Indo-Pacific region. And so as it becomes more complicated, more difficult to maintain, conduct, and expand trade relations with some of those traditional big markets, I think I think it very well could sort of strengthen relations between countries of the global south. Now, in particular, when we think about BRICS, here's what I would say, and I'll just be very candid in my opinions. I think BRICS has certainly got the potential to play the type of role that you're asking about, but, and this is a very big but, it would have to evolve beyond its current form, in which it's a bit of a talk shop. It's a bit of an opportunity to discuss collaboration. It's an opportunity for leaders to show up, shake hands, and get their pictures taken. The other comment I'd make about BRICS is, I don't know what the identity of BRICS is, because the identity of BRICS is largely articulated in terms of what the members do not want. The members do not want a US-led global system. Okay, got it. That much is clear. But what is the cohesive vision that binds the BRICS members together? What other than we don't want the US? And I think that's a real challenge, because if you look at the members of BRICS, and again, just being candid, there's some really important differences in viewpoint across the BRICS membership. Now, just, you talk about a couple of the sort of cornerstone, big boys in BRICS, Russia and China. Reflect for a minute how profoundly different the worldview of those countries, and in particular the two leaders of those two countries, are. Xi Jinping looks at the way the global system has operated for the past 3 to 4 decades, and he sees a system that has facilitated China's ability to execute one of, if not the most incredible economic development success stories in recorded history. So he looks at the past 3 to 4 decades and says, well, yes, we'd like to make some changes. We'd like to play a greater leadership role. But he looks at the way the world system has functioned for the past 3 to 4 decades, and he sees a success story. Now, switch over to Vladimir Putin. Putin looks at the way the global system has played out for the last 3 to 4 decades, and he sees what he has articulated as one of the greatest disasters of the 20th century, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, so this is a fundamentally different perspective on the world and the world order, and what the history of our recent decades have been. There's certainly the potential for BRICS to play that type of role that you're asking about, Nisha, but there are a lot of issues and a lot of challenges here that have to get ironed out.
Sure. Stephen, can you suggest one thing that they might want to come together with, and which would be food for thought for these countries to take forward, to be more constructive, to be able to participate together? Is there anything that you would suggest?
I guess one thing I would say is, to the extent the members of the BRICS could start to ratchet up the formality, I think that sends a really important lesson to business. So even if it was to start modestly, to start moving from, this sort of informal discussion forum for areas of collaboration, to the extent the governments were willing to sort of sign on the dotted line and saying, we are committed to taking the following steps. And maybe this is something simple as trade facilitation. There's a lot that remains to be done on trade facilitation to make it easier for trade and investment to flow among these countries. But something that signals to business executives that there really is some meat on the bones here.
As you mentioned that, like, obviously BRICS is not really a cohesive group. There's a lot of differences in the interest also, and it's very difficult to convince other countries to come together and work under BRICS. But the issue is that is there another alternative? Within the BRICS, if you look at individual countries' cooperation and collaboration with other countries in the region is pretty. Do you think the expansion of BRICS, and especially the BRI Belt and Road Initiative of China, will it make it a kind of a binding initiative? Because BRICS, as you say, is right that it is just a talk shop as of today. So how do you see BRICS future, with expansion, without expansion, and the role in international trade?
Well, look, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I do think BRI has a lot of potential. I mean, if China is really willing to put its money where its mouth is and make significant investments to improve the connectivity between BRICS partners, I think in practical terms that would help. And I think it would be very important to send that signal that I think a lot of businesses are really waiting to see, that yes, look, this is really something that's going to happen. The other comment I'd make, and I think this would be more true the more countries that get drawn in, the more countries with diverse interests, it might be, I stress might be, it might be worth considering within the BRICS groupings if a smaller subset of like-minded BRICS members wanted to be a little bit more ambitious and wanted to push the envelope a little bit and move forward in one area or another. Maybe it's investment, maybe it's in reducing some non-tariff barriers, maybe it's on digital issues, whatever the case might be. If you get a smaller subset of like-minded countries that kind of blaze the trail, so BRICS expands, it's 5, it's 6, it's 12, it's 20, it's 40, whatever. If that grouping is going to act on an entirely consensus basis, given the wide range of interests, of perspectives, I don't know how much it's going to accomplish. So it might be worth considering allowing those countries so inclined, with like-minded interests on particular issues, to move forward. But I would be concerned, as when we talk about expansion and you bring in an ever-widening range of countries with an ever-widening range of sensitivities, of viewpoints, of priorities, that might make consensus decision-making even more difficult.
So that was, we've covered China and the US, we've covered the BRICS countries, we've covered the Indo-Pacific. Let's come to Africa. What do you think the African Continental Free Trade Agreement could mean? Do you think it could provide the much needed resilience for the Global South against the global developments that are happening?
I think the devil always lies in the details. And we have a tendency sometimes to make the mistake of thinking all free trade agreements are created equal, when in fact they're not. So if this is intended to be implemented as a high ambition, deep integration agreement, it has the potential. But unfortunately, we see a lot of agreements that leave a significant number of barriers and restrictions in place, and at the end of the day, really don't move the dial. Africa faces two really big challenges here. Um, Assume a more optimistic scenario and assume that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement really delivers the goods. Can Africa's transportation network handle a dramatic increase in trade and investment? No, as of today. So even if you make all your most optimistic assumptions about that agreement, is the transportation network sufficient to the job? The second point I would make, and this applies well beyond Africa and is certainly the case in Southeast Asia, we know that FTAs in countries that are primarily SME oriented have abysmal FTA utilization rates. So again, make our most optimistic assumptions about the free trade agreement itself, but we know we've got a track record here that agreements combining countries that are predominantly SMEs, they don't know how to use the agreement.
See, I just want to ask a very kind of a contemporary questions and all. Now, the Trump has given a number of threats, like initially he said that he'll put 10% duty, then he said 60% on China. Now he says 100% on BRICS countries who are going to support de-dollarization. Do you think that he will carry these threats just a negotiation tactic? If he not really implement it, does it create an additional opportunity or threat to global South or the developing countries to trade?
Yeah, yes to all of the above. I think with Trump, the only certainty is uncertainty. And I think that's to the extent he's got a plan. I think that's his plan. He has stated directly that he believes one of his greatest assets is his unpredictability. He just shoots very much from the hip. Now, I think the one thing he is clear on is that the more he shoots off in all these tangents, Canada, Mexico, 25% tariffs, global tariff, that this gives him leverage. But I wouldn't get lulled into a false sense of complacency that, oh, this is just a negotiating tactic. Because I think he's perfectly willing to move forward with some or all of the tariffs he's threatened. So does he intend it as a negotiating tactic? Does he see it providing him with leverage? Yes, I believe that that's the case. But don't take too much comfort from that, because he will be perfectly willing to move forward with those tariffs if he doesn't feel like he has some quote unquote victories that he can demonstrate in return for forestalling those tariffs. So, anyone trying to follow the bouncing ball on his tariff announcements, I wish you good luck. I think the only certainty is uncertainty, but do not get lulled into a false sense of security. I think he's perfectly willing to move forward with at least some portion of the tariffs. He views trade as a zero-sum game in which there's a winner and a loser. And the scorecard we use to judge who is winning or who is losing is who's got the surplus. And so when he sees Vietnam sitting there as number 4, my advice to my colleagues and friends and officials in Vietnam would be start preparing for some increased scrutiny from the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was an interesting take. Stephen, now let's move to the other side of the pendulum, which is this, this increasing intertwining of trade and values. And values, they could be endless, and they could span from say environmental issues to human rights to labor rights to friendshoring. So there is a huge spectrum over which they are being kind of used with trade. So what do you think is going to be the impact on the global south of all these developments, and how do you think they're going to navigate through this?
Well, I'm really glad you raised this point because I think it's increasingly important, and I think it's underappreciated. We're really experiencing a profound shift here. Whereas since the end of the Second World War, trade has been conducted primarily on the basis of economic efficiencies, optimized sourcing and production for corporations, lower pricing and higher quality products for consumers. But now, as you alluded to, trade is increasingly being used as a tool to advance a whole host of NTOs, non-trade objectives. And frequently, these non-trade objectives, things that have nothing to do with trade per se, are very, very, very value laden, are closely connected with highly subjective social values. So if you think for an instant, the number of these values related issues that are increasingly moving front and center on the trade agenda, it's really quite astounding. Religious freedom, press freedom, diversity and inclusion, indigenous rights, governance models. Are democracies inherently better than autocracies, or it doesn't matter? So a whole host of these issues that when I started my career as a trade negotiator in the 1980s, we would have been astounded to think that trade negotiators and trade agreements were going to be dealing with rights of indigenous people. It would have been incomprehensible to us. So for a minute, what I would say is, and certainly labor and environment. And on environment, the particularly thorny question of how to apportion responsibility for fixing climate change. We know who caused climate change. We know who industrialized first, Europeans and Americans. Okay, but now the leading sources of a lot of those emissions are coming increasingly from less developed countries. So, to a certain extent, it's a values-laden judgment. Well, who should pay the cost for that? Who should pay the bills for that transition? So the complication that we've really got to start wrapping our brain around, set aside the relative merits or demerits of any of these issues, indigenous rights, press freedoms. Think about how it complicates the trade agenda. Because one of the things I learned 27 years ago as an American when I started living in non-Western cultures is that a lot of the values that Americans and Europeans very confidently assert as universal values are in fact not universal. They're American values, they're European values. And so you have a big problem with a perception in the global South that the European Union and the Americans in particular are sort of trying to force their values down the throats of very different cultures and very different societies which don't share those values. So that's one problem. The other problem that you have is that a lot of countries in the global South do not believe it. They do not believe that any of this is motivated by a sincere interest in social values. I would suggest that one value that truly is universal is people do not like hypocrisy. Okay, I don't know of any country, any culture where people like hypocrisy. And so, it does not escape the attention of developing countries that the Americans come in and say, we're all about values. We're all about values. We care about human rights. Except if you have oil, because we really need oil. So if you've got oil, you get a free pass. You get a free pass on human rights. We'll park our human rights concerns over here, right? So you can't get away with that. You can't get away with that. People have eyes, people have ears, people see this. So I think it's going to be an issue of really growing difficulty. And if I may add, I think one that really could rebound to the benefit of China. Because one sentiment that has almost become a cliche, certainly in Southeast Asia, but I would say throughout the Indo-Pacific, in Latin America, on the African continent, is it goes something like this. Officials in these countries complain, they say, you know what? When the Americans get off the plane, they give me a lecture about press freedom. When the Chinese get off the plane, they build an airport. So, yeah.
That's very well said.
So for those reasons, I do think this could rebound to China's benefit.
Yeah, so that's the world that we are living in today. And thank you for letting us know what is the world that we're living in today and how nations are trading with each other with values. Literally, we're trading values.
Yeah.
So, with all these developments, do you actually see the South coming together and having their own set of values, or even to coming together to say, to hell with these values? You know, we just want to trade in goods and services. Do you think that might be a scenario?
Here's what I would say. I wouldn't necessarily predict that, but it's not 1965. It's 2025, and these countries have a lot more alternatives, a lot more opportunities, and I sense a real increasing frustration level and a desire not to be caught in the middle in all of these superpower rivalries. So the potential is there, but I do not for 1 minute underestimate some of the antipathies that exist between countries in the global south that could frustrate the ability to form a more cohesive economic relationship. So this is the most propitious time, in my opinion, in the post-war era, but it will remain to be seen whether or not that initiative can successfully be seized.
It was a great learning, and it was great talking to you, Dr. Olson. And thank you so much for being with us. Nisha, thank you so much for being with us. You wanted to.
Thank you, Stephen, for being with us.